I stood there at my daughter's book launch and heard her say, "Thank you, Mom-in-law. I wish you had raised me. I gave birth to her. I starved so she could go to school. And now I'm invisible." If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss the most haunting episodes we tell. The laughter swirled in warm waves around the marble-floored atrium. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above clusters of elegant guests, sipping champagne and clinking glasses. In the center of it all, Isabella stood on a small stage, the cover of her newly published book projected behind her. Gold letters against a deep emerald green background. The modern matriarch. Althea Monroe sat near the back of the room, barely more than a silhouette against the flickering light. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap gloves, still on a small velvet clutch resting beside her on the chair. Her gray coat, simple, a bit too warm for the indoor venue, remained buttoned all the way to her neck. She hadn't touched her drink. It was Dylan who stood beside Isabella, now holding a flute of something sparkling and expensive, cheeks slightly pink, either from pride or wine. He adjusted his collar, glanced once toward the back of the room, without seeming to truly register the woman seated there, and cleared his throat. "I just want to take a moment." He began smiling as he glanced at Isabella to say something personal. The room quieted. Phones hovered in midair, ready to capture a soundbite. "I've always believed that strong women raise stronger generations," he continued. "And tonight, as I celebrate this incredible woman and her work," he nodded toward Isabella, "I'm also reflecting on the women who shaped us." Althea blinked gently. Her breathing slowed. "There's one woman who really modeled what grace, wit, and modern strength look like. She's not just brilliant, she's bold, magnetic, she's everything I hope our daughter can look up to one day." People leaned in. "And that woman is my mother-in-law, Evelyn Castor." There it was. The room erupted in applause. Althea didn't move. Her hands were still folded one over the other. But something behind her eyes, something fine and invisible, cracked. She watched Dylan smile at the applause, at Isabella kissing his cheek, and she couldn't help but hear the silence of her own name. Not once spoken, not once even acknowledged. She had spent years believing that one day, perhaps at an event like this, her name might surface. Just one word Althea spoken with love. But tonight she was just a coat on a chair, a silence in the crowd, a woman watching her only son perform a version of himself that had no place for her. And it wasn't only the absence that stung, it was the contrast. Modern strength, he had said. A not-so-subtle way of saying that whatever she had offered wasn't good enough. When the applause settled and the music swelled again, Althea stood quietly. No one noticed. No one turned to see her coat shift or her purse being picked up, or the way her face didn't crack even as her chest did. At the corner of the room where a table of first editions and promotional bookmarks stood unattended, she reached into her bag and placed a small velvet-wrapped box next to the pile. It looked out of place, delicate, old-fashioned, too personal. No one stopped her. No one asked anything. She walked out without speaking a word. The door didn't slam. The world didn't stop. She simply disappeared into the corridor, her shoes silent against the marble floor. It wasn't until well after midnight that Isabella noticed the box. She had been flitting through the living room of their high-rise apartment, glass of red wine in hand, debriefing the event on a phone call with her editor. "Oh my God, that quote from Dylan," she said, laughing. "We should include it in the Sunday feature. The real matriarch is my mother-in-law. It's gold." She paused near the edge of the sofa, finally seeing the box resting on the corner console table. She squinted. "What's this?" she muttered more to herself. Setting her wine down, she unwrapped the fabric. Inside was a small mirror, oval-shaped, perhaps 8 inches tall, framed in antique silver, with delicate etching all around the border. The back was made of polished black lacquered wood, and engraved in the center was a single small symbol, a circle intersected with an hourglass shape. Beneath it, a line of Latin text worn down from time solum videbit. She tilted her head. Weird. From the hallway, Dylan's voice called out, "What's that?" "Something your mom left," Isabella said. "Looks handmade. Creepy kind of." He entered shirtless, towel over his shoulder, drying his hair. She left something. Isabella held the mirror up. I found it next to the display copies. No note. Dylan walked over, staring at the object with faint confusion. Is that one of her old frame pieces? I don't know, Isabella said. It feels heavy. He took it gently from her hands, turning it over. The etching along the frame caught the low kitchen light, a pattern of twisting vines or perhaps smoke. He examined the Latin, frowning. What's it say? Isabella asked, sipping her wine. Dylan shrugged. Something like, only those who are seen will see, I think. She snorted. Sounds like something out of one of your mom's cryptic letters. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared into the mirror, his brow furrowed. The reflection shifted. For a fraction of a second, he didn't see the apartment. He didn't see Isabella or himself. He saw a boy, 8, maybe 9, sleeping on a worn sofa under a patchwork quilt. A fire crackled nearby. A woman sat beside him, mending a coat. Her hands were calloused, moving with careful efficiency. He blinked. The apartment was back. You okay? Isabella asked. Yeah, he muttered. I thought I saw something. She gave him a sideways look. What a ghost of Christmas past. He forced a chuckle. Just tired. Probably the wine. But as he handed the mirror back to her, he noticed something odd, a faint red smear across his finger. A nick. He hadn't even felt the glass cut him. He excused himself, muttering something about needing sleep. That night, as Dylan lay in bed beside Isabella, eyes wide open in the dark, he replayed the reflection. The quilt. The firelight. His mother's silent figure. Her hands. Why had he forgotten that coat? Why had he forgotten that night? And why now was it coming back? In the living room, the mirror sat propped against the wall. It faced nothing, yet in its glass something moved, something remembered. The morning light filtered through gauzy curtains, thin as breath, soft as memory. Dylan stood in the bedroom, half-buttoned dress shirt draped over his shoulders, gaze fixed on the mirror propped against the far wall. It shouldn't have drawn his attention. It was just a mirror. Antique, oddly shaped, framed in tarnished silver with curled etchings along its edges. It didn't match anything else in their sleek modern apartment, all brushed steel and Scandinavian wood. And yet it sat there upright and still, like it belonged. Like it had always been there waiting. He tugged the shirt straighter, smoothing it across his chest. Dylan. Isabella called from the kitchen. You're going to be late. Just a sec, he replied, eyes still locked on the glass. At first he only saw himself, sharp cheekbones, freshly shaved jaw, the faint tension already etched between his brows. But as he adjusted the collar, the image in the mirror didn't adjust with him. It shifted. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. In the reflection, the shirt he wore dissolved into a thin cotton pajama top. The walls behind him faded into peeling wallpaper darkened by time. A wood stove crackled in the corner of a dim room. The floor sagged slightly, and on an old threadbare couch lay a small boy curled up beneath a patchwork quilt, his quilt. And kneeling beside him, gently adjusting the blanket around his shoulders, was Althea, his mother, younger, leaner, her hair still dark. She looked exhausted, shoulders hunched, fingers raw, a bandage wrapped around one palm. Yet her eyes were focused only on the boy, tender, protective, afraid of the cold, afraid of not enough. Dylan's heart lodged in his throat. He turned sharply, breath-hitching. Behind him, nothing. Just the bed, the beige walls, the humming air purifier near the window. What the hell? He turned back. The mirror showed only his reflection, again shirt half-buttoned, eyes wide, color drained. Babe, he called out, voice tight. Isabella appeared in the doorway, nursing a coffee mug. What? Did you see that? See what? He gestured vaguely toward the mirror. There was something weird. Like the image glitched, or lagged, or... You think the mirror has a lag? I'm serious. Isabella stepped into the room, giving him a once-over. Looks fine to me. Maybe you slept weird. Light's been bouncing off that window funny all morning. Dylan stared at the glass again. It was back to normal, almost disappointingly so. I don't know, it showed me something, I think. Isabella sipped her coffee. Maybe you're just finally confronting your inner child. Want me to get the wine? Izzy, I'm kidding. She leaned in, kissed his cheek, and walked back out, her perfume lingering in the doorway longer than she did. Dylan sat on the edge of the bed, hands on his knees. For a moment he thought about calling his mother, just to say something. But the thought passed as quickly as it arrived. The silence between them had grown too heavy for a casual check-in. He hadn't returned her last message, or the one before that. And what would he even say? "Hey, Mom, your mirror is doing weird things, showing me you when you used to matter." That night, the mirror was moved to the hallway. Isabella claimed it clashed with the bedroom. Dylan didn't object, but it was still there, still watching, still waiting. At 3:19 a.m., Dylan sat upright in bed, drenched in sweat. No noise had woken him, no dream he could remember, just a pulse of unease like the air had shifted. He padded barefoot into the hall. The mirror waited. He stood before it in boxers and a threadbare t-shirt. The hallway was dim lit only by the faint blue glow from the microwave clock in the adjacent kitchen. He stared. Nothing, just himself, pale, tired, jaw clenched, eyes that didn't blink. He was about to turn away when the reflection began to move just a tremble in the glass, like wind rippling across water. And then the background shifted again. Now the scene was different. There was the old kitchen from his childhood. Tiny cramped the counters lined with mismatched cups and chipped mugs. The window above the sink was cracked and taped in one corner. A single oil lamp flickered on the table. And Althea, his mother, sat at the table in her nightgown, bent over a jacket with a thick needle in hand, threading a button onto the chest pocket with steady fingers. Her face was pinched in concentration, a faint bruise visible on her wrist. The room was cold. He could tell from the way her breath fogged slightly in the air. She looked so small in that kitchen, so quiet. The kind of quiet that came not from peace, but from fatigue, from holding too much for too long. Dylan pressed his hand to the glass fingers, trembling. The image vanished, just his own face again, just the hallway, just a man sweating in silence. He stumbled back to bed, heart pounding, the echo of her fingers sewing still burning behind his eyelids. When morning came, he didn't mention it, not to Isabella, not even to himself. He avoided the mirror, bypassing it like one might avoid a photograph of a lost friend. But as he reached for his tie near the console table, his hand brushed the corner of the frame. A sharp sting bloomed on his index finger. He drew back. A clean slice. No glass was broken, no visible edge. Yet the skin was cleanly nicked. Blood welled. Shit. He wrapped the finger in a tissue, eyes darting back to the mirror. It looked the same, but something inside it didn't. Later that day, he stood in the elevator, his bandaged finger pulsing faintly. An old woman stepped in beside him, glanced at the gauze and said gently, "Old wounds always know when to speak." He blinked, startled. She smiled like she hadn't said anything strange at all. When he reached the lobby, he stopped at the front desk. "Do you know if any packages were left last night?" he asked the concierge. "No, sir. Just your guest from the signing. She left before midnight." "She leave anything?" The concierge tilted his head. "No, sir." Dylan nodded, murmured a thank you, and stepped out into the street. The city was moving fast around him, horns, people rushing, everything forward motion. But something inside him had turned, tilted, slowed. That night when he got home, the mirror was waiting in the hall. Silent, unbroken, unforgiving. The mirror didn't wait for him to be ready. It never did. That evening, Dylan walked down the hallway, slowly, towel slung over his shoulder, after a long shower, hair-damp, mind frayed. The day had been a blur. Emails, unanswered meetings, half-absorbed Isabella complaining that he wasn't present. She'd rolled her eyes when he told her he wasn't sleeping well. Maybe lay off the espresso, she'd said, not unkindly, but with that tone. The one that said this wasn't her problem. He paused by the mirror now, leaning against the narrow wall beside their coat closet. Something inside him didn't want to look, and yet there he was. The frame shimmered faintly. The glass clouded just briefly, then cleared. The room inside wasn't familiar at first. A pawn shop. No too elegant. A dim boutique cluttered with old silver crystal velvet-lined display cases, and there, near the front counter, stood Althea. She looked younger again, early 40s maybe, though the weight of something heavy hung from her shoulders. In her hand was a small black box. She opened it. Inside lay her wedding necklace, a delicate silver chain with a single sapphire pendant. Dylan recognized it instantly. She had worn it once a year on her anniversary. His father used to call it the night drop because it glinted like a raindrop caught in moonlight. Althea ran her thumb across it once, then handed it over to the man behind the counter. He examined it, nodded solemnly. She didn't bargain, didn't hesitate, just nodded back. The register drawer opened. She took the cash with steady hands, folded it into a worn envelope, and tucked it into her coat. The image blurred. When it cleared again, she was at a hospital reception desk. She slid the envelope across the counter and signed a form. A nurse pointed her toward the hallway, and then Dylan saw it. Him, 12 years old, gaunt, lying in a hospital bed of V, and his arm lips pale. The room was quiet. The beeping was slow. A bouquet of gas station carnations wilted on the windowsill. Althea. Dylan sat at his desk, the room dim except for the faint glow of his laptop screen. On the desk beside it, the mirror sat wrapped in a towel. He couldn't bring himself to store it away, but he also couldn't leave it out exposed, staring at him. He'd opened browser tab after tab, searching for that phrase again. Solum videbit. Nothing useful. One academic article in Latin that led nowhere, a few forums about esoteric artifacts, a Reddit thread that spiraled into nonsense. But then finally he found something. A digitized archive from a European design exhibition catalog dated 1997. The entry was brief. Featured work. Custom ornate glassworks by Althea Monroe, known for her emotional encoding technique, and hand-carved maker's mark, a circle intersected with an hourglass symbolizing memory and sacrifice. He leaned in. A photo accompanied the text. The same symbol. Her symbol. The mark was subtle in the photograph but unmistakable. It was the same etched signature from the back of the mirror now resting beside him. So it really had been her. Not just a coincidence. Not a hallucination. The mirror wasn't just an heirloom, it was a message, a door. He opened a folder of old papers in the filing cabinet. His mother had given them to him years ago, claiming they were just for your records. He'd never read them. But now, flipping through manila envelopes and handwritten notes, he spotted a resume. Her resume. It listed in neat penmanship private commissions for Fallow Estate, the Dandridge Manor, and the Covington Residency. He froze. The Covington Residency. That name rang like cold glass in his memory. Isabella's ex-boyfriend, Miles, his family had lived there. One of those sprawling, untouchable houses in the north part of the city where fences were taller than people and gates had names engraved in bronze. He remembered now, vividly, the shame, the smell of that marble foyer. He'd been 17. Althea had asked him to come along to drop off her final commissioned piece, a full-length gilded mirror she had crafted for the Covingtons' upstairs parlor. Dylan had begged her not to make him go. She'd insisted, said it might be good for him to see the kinds of homes where art lived. He had walked in behind her, his jeans too, faded, his sneakers scuffed, clutching a folder in his hands, his scholarship application to a visual arts high school. A woman with icy blonde hair met them at the door. She looked over Althea's mirror with minimal interest and offered a stiff nod. "It's quaint," the woman said. "A little provincial, perhaps. But it'll do. Just try to keep the fingerprinting to a minimum." Althea had smiled politely, said nothing. Dylan had wanted to vanish. But what burned the most wasn't the way the woman looked at the mirror. It was the way she looked at his mother. Like a housekeeper. Like a dust mark. Like something she'd forgotten to wipe away. Dylan had slipped away into the hallway while they finalized payment. He pulled out the scholarship folder and stared at it. He could hear laughter from the garden. He looked through the glass pane of the back door and saw them. Miles and his friends lounging with drinks, perfect clothes, expensive watches, the kind of ease that came from never having to look at price tags. One of the girls laughed at something, tossing her head. She was wearing a necklace just like the one his mother had sold to pay his hospital bill, except newer, shinier, and in that moment something cracked inside him. He walked out into the garden. Miles called out, "Dee, what's up?" Dylan held up the folder. This, he said, voice loud enough for them all to hear. "Just a joke." He tore it in half. No one asked why. One of the guys laughed. Dylan forced a grin, then turned back inside. He found his mother waiting at the door, her hands carefully folded over her purse. She didn't ask where the folder was. She didn't say anything at all. Later that night at home, Dylan had slammed the bedroom door and pretended to sleep. but through the crack in the curtain he'd seen her on the porch under the yellow porch light. She was sitting in the creaky old chair with the split cushion sewing the tear in his backpack from where it had snagged on the Covington gate. Her fingers moved steadily, pulling thread through frayed canvas. Her face soft, resigned, not disappointed, not angry, just present. She didn't ask for thanks, and he never offered one. That memory, the real memory, flooded his mind now as he stood in front of the mirror again. The moment didn't appear in the glass this time. He didn't need it to. It was already inside him. He felt nauseous. He staggered back into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands. Isabella was sitting on the couch, scrolling her phone. She didn't look up. He stood in the doorway and stared at her. "Did I ever tell you why I didn't go to art school?" he asked. She blinked. "What?" "I got in. I had the paperwork. The scholarship was approved, but I threw it away." Isabella frowned. "Why?" "Because I didn't want anyone to know where I came from." He sat down across from her, the glass untouched in his hand. "I let shame decide who I was going to be." She raised an eyebrow. "And now, I don't know. But I think the mirror is trying to show me what she wouldn't say out loud." "You mean your mom?" He nodded slowly. "Every scene I've seen in that thing. It's not just memory. It's record. It's proof of all the ways she stood behind me. And I didn't even know." Isabella leaned back. "Or maybe it's your guilt inventing proof." Dylan stared at her for a long time. "Maybe," he said, "but even if it is, maybe it's still true." She didn't respond. He stood. "I need to find her." "Where would she even be?" He paused. "I think I'll know when I get close." Back in the hallway, he touched the frame again. This time it didn't cut. It only hummed soft and steady, like the sound of thread pulling through old canvas, like the sound of memory refusing to be erased. The argument started over something stupid. They always did. A dinner plate left in the sink, a late meeting, a half-charged phone. But this time it wasn't the plate, or the silence, or even the exhaustion between them. It was the way Isabella looked at him across the dining table, fork in hand, and said so casually, so offhandedly, "I'm just saying, I would never let my kid grow up the way you did." She didn't even flinch. Dylan blinked. "What?" Isabella sipped her wine, swirling it like she hadn't just slapped his childhood across the face. "I mean," she shrugged. "No offense, but you told me yourself you lived in that crumbling little rental, didn't even have central heat. You said your mom patched your jeans with duct tape once. I'm just saying we can give our kid better than that." Something sharp and invisible cracked behind his ribs. He set down his fork. "You think that's what growing up like me means?" Isabella didn't hear the warning in his voice, or she didn't care. "I just think a child deserves comfort, safety, predictability, not broken boilers and cheap peanut butter sandwiches." Dylan stood slowly, the chair legs grating against the floor. She looked up, mildly annoyed. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. He walked down the hall. The mirror was waiting. He stared into the glass, and it opened. There it was, winter. His breath fogging in the air, 12 years old, bundled in 2 mismatched sweaters, trying to hold a flashlight steady while Althea knelt in the mud under the house. He remembered this night. The pipes had frozen. The landlord had refused to send help until morning. Water had flooded the crawl space, and they couldn't afford a plumber. So Althea had gone down there herself, in her coat, in the freezing dark. He'd begged her not to. She'd kissed his forehead and said, "Hold the light still, sweetheart." And there she was now again, replayed in perfect memory. Elbow deep in muck sleeves, soaked, trying to clamp a leaking pipe with an old wrench and a towel. Her hands bled. Her fingers shook. But she didn't stop. The flashlight in his hand trembled. And when she finally crawled out, shivering, soaked through, she had smiled. "Warm bath coming up," she had said, cheeks blue with cold. The image blurred. Dylan stepped back. His breath came hard, like he'd just sprinted 10 blocks uphill. From the kitchen, Isabella's voice drifted. "Are you seriously going to walk away from a conversation?" He didn't answer. He went to the closet, pulled on a jacket. He had to find her. He had to see her. But when he drove to the old house on Ivy Ridge, there was a redwood fence where the porch used to be. New numbers on the curb. Strangers' cars in the driveway. He parked anyway. Rang the bell. A woman answered, mid-50s, polite but suspicious. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "Did you buy this place recently?" She nodded. 6 months ago. Did the previous owner? Her name was Althea Monroe. Leave a forwarding address. She frowned. No. And there wasn't much left behind, just an empty studio, a bunch of paint-splattered drop cloths, and a box of broken mirrors. Dylan's stomach dropped. Did you keep any of it? Sorry, no. We donated most of it. The mirrors were cracked. Probably went to the dump. He thanked her hollow. Back in his car, he sat with the engine off, staring at the wheel like it might tell him what to do next. He tried the local church. Father Renner had known Althea, had spoken at his father's funeral. The secretary checked the list. No one by that name's been here in over a year, she said. Are you sure she didn't move out of state? He tried the Buddhist center near the river, the place she used to bring him when she needed quiet. Althea Monroe, the nun said, thoughtful. That name does sound familiar, but I haven't seen her since the last lantern walk. That was last spring. He tried the community shelter on Bramble Avenue. She volunteered here, a young woman said. Once a week, taught art to the kids. But then she stopped coming, said she needed to make something final. No address, no phone, just echoes. He drove for hours, ending up parked in front of a closed hardware store at midnight, windshield fogged with his own breath. His phone buzzed. A text from Isabella. We need to talk. He stared at it, then turned the screen off. He went home barely remembering how he got there. Stumbled into the apartment, peeled off his coat, and dropped it on the floor. On the kitchen table sat a sealed envelope. His name on the front, in his mother's handwriting. His heart stopped. He reached for it with shaking hands, thumbed open the flap, and slid out a single sheet of thick paper. It was short, to the point. No guilt, no plea, just clarity. Dylan. Don't try to find me. The truth you're looking for isn't in where I went. It's in what you've become. I don't need to be seen. You do. Mom. There was no return address. No clue where it came from. Just a name on the bottom and a weight in his chest like lead. He looked toward the hallway. The mirror shimmered, but tonight he didn't look in. He sat in the dark instead, and wept. The apartment was quiet, unnaturally so. Dylan sat alone on the couch, the letter from his mother still in his lap, its final words echoing louder than any scream could have. Don't try to find me. It's in what you've become. He stared ahead, not at the wall, not at the window, at the mirror. That damn mirror. It sat just 10 feet away in the hallway, resting against the baseboard, like it had grown roots in the wood. Its surface reflected the room faintly, but he knew better now. It wasn't glass. It was memory, judgment, truth in silver. Dylan stood, walked toward it barefoot, the floor cold, his hands colder. As he stood before it, he felt the ache rise in his ribs. The mirror rippled not visually, not physically, but emotionally, as if it exhaled something into the room, something it had been holding, waiting to reveal. He didn't flinch when the image changed. It was his wedding day. Not his face, but the photo they used in the magazine article that followed Isabella's book launch. A picture-perfect couple framed by curated florals, white linen, and an aisle that cost more than his mother's entire kitchen. He remembered what the editor had asked. Is your mother coming? He'd laughed, shrugged, said something like, she's more traditional, it's not really her scene. He hadn't sent the invitation. He hadn't wanted the risk of her showing up in a homemade dress with scuffed shoes and that stubborn posture that said she belonged anywhere even when no one else thought so. The mirror changed again. Now it was a panel interview. Dylan beside Isabella, microphones in front of them. The host leaned in. Your parents must be so proud. Dylan had smiled, paused, said, Isabella's mother's been our biggest supporter. Just that. No mention of Althea. No nod to the woman who had sewn his first tie, who had worked 2 shifts to buy the shoes he wore that day. He had erased her. Neatly, elegantly, publicly. The mirror changed again. This time he was 2 years younger on a podcast. Would you say your success was self-made? The host asked. I had to unlearn a lot of limiting beliefs growing up, he said. Limiting beliefs. He hadn't realized how much those words would cost until now. Althea hadn't even called after that. Not once. He had taken her silence as agreement. But it wasn't agreement. It was grief. The mirror flickered one more time, and now the image was grainy, VHS quality, familiar. He was no more than a toddler, arms outstretched, legs shaky. Rain outside, a patch of cracked cement, and Althea kneeling, drenched hair plastered to her face, arms wide. Come on, baby, she said, laughing. Come to Mama. He had waddled toward her, fallen, cried. She had scooped him up, pressed him to her chest, held him even as the rain came down harder. That moment, tiny and vast, pressed against the inside of Dylan's skull like a scream. He reached out to the mirror. His hand trembled. Then all at once rage, shame, regret. He grabbed the nearest object he could, an umbrella stand, metal and tall, and swung it into the mirror. The clang echoed. The glass should have shattered, but it didn't. The stand fell to the floor. The mirror stayed still. The reflection, just him. Not the wedding, not the rain, not Althea. Just Dylan, barefoot, eyes swollen, face pale, and yet he wasn't 29 anymore. The mirror showed him younger, smaller, a child, a boy frozen mid-step, eyes wide with fear. Not of the world, of himself. He collapsed to his knees. The air punched from his lungs. The tears came without permission, hot and silent, carving tracks down his face. He pressed his forehead to the base of the mirror. "I'm sorry," he whispered, over and over. A prayer, a confession, a truth too late. He didn't hear Isabella come in, but when he looked up, she was standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "What is this?" she asked. He wiped his face, chest heaving. "I needed to see." "See what?" "Her." Isabella looked down at him like he was something cracked across a museum floor. "I can't do this, Dylan." He didn't answer. She stepped closer. "That mirror, it's a curse. You're obsessed with it. You're obsessed with her." Dylan shook his head slowly. "I'm not obsessed. I'm ashamed." "Well," she said, "it's starting to look the same." He stood, legs weak, voice rough. "She gave up everything. And..." He looked at her, stunned. Isabella sighed. "You want to know the truth," she said. "I've never understood your guilt. Your mom chose a hard life. That was her decision. That doesn't mean it should hang over our heads forever." He blinked. "It's not hanging over us. It's sitting in front of me. And for the first time, I'm not looking away." Isabella crossed her arms tighter. "If you can't let go of her, we don't have a future." Dylan stared at her, and he knew she wasn't bluffing. This was the moment, her line in the sand. And something inside him didn't step over. He looked at the mirror one last time, not to see his mother, not to see the past, to see himself, truly, fully. Then he looked back at Isabella. "If letting go of her means pretending she didn't build the ground I stand on," he said quietly, "then maybe you're right. Maybe we don't have a future." Isabella said nothing, did nothing. She turned, walked out, and didn't close the door behind her. The echo of her heels on the floor was the only sound. Dylan stayed standing, his breath steady now, his hands no longer trembling. He sat down in front of the mirror again, cross-legged like a boy in a classroom. No performance, no witnesses, just him and the glass. And for the first time, he wasn't asking the mirror to show him something. He was showing himself. The silence in the apartment didn't last, not after that. It broke the next morning, sharp and deliberate, when Isabella slammed the cabinet hard enough for the coffee mugs to tremble. Dylan sat at the edge of the couch, eyes still fixed on the mirror, now carefully leaned back against the wall. A folded towel cushioned its base as if it were a wounded thing. Isabella's voice sliced through the space. "You didn't come to bed." Dylan didn't answer. "I said, I know what you said." She crossed the room, arms folded, robe knotted tight. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "It's a piece of glass, Dylan. That's all it is." "It's not," she scoffed, pacing now. "You're acting like this mirror is some kind of oracle, like it has answers." He looked at her, slow and steady. "It has memory." She laughed loud, bitter. "No, what it has is your mother, still, always." He didn't respond. That seemed to enrage her more. "You know what I think? I think you like punishing yourself. You like being the poor, neglected son. You like swimming in guilt so you don't have to deal with real life." He stood up slowly. Don't, what she barked. "Tell the truth." He stepped between her and the mirror, his hand resting on its frame, protecting it. "She raised me on her knees, on floors she scrubbed, with hands that bled." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "And you think that makes you a better person than me? Because your mom struggled, and mine didn't." "No," he said. "But it means I owe her something more than silence. She made her choices, Dylan. Everyone does." "No, she made sacrifices. That's different." Isabella's voice dropped low and lethal. "And what about me, huh? What about the sacrifices I've made for this relationship?" He stared at her. "Like what?" "Not wanting my mother at our wedding. Not wanting her name in the articles because she didn't fit the aesthetic." She stepped closer, teeth clenched. "You're obsessed with her." "No," he said. "I'm just finally telling the truth about her." That did it. Her eyes flared. Her hand shot out. She grabbed the mirror by its edge and yanked. "Don't you!" he shouted. But it was too late. She flung it toward the floor. It landed hard. A sound like wind caught in metal filled the room. A sharp crack spider-webbed across the bottom right corner. Dylan lunged. He fell to his knees, hands moving frantically over the frame, checking for worse damage. The crack was thin hairline, but it was there. He pulled the mirror into his chest, cradling it like a wounded child, his body wrapped around it. And then he wept. Not loud, not theatrical. It was the kind of crying that came from the spine, the kind that trembled through the bones, the kind no one gets to see unless they've earned it. "You don't know," he whispered, "how many times she saved me." Isabella didn't speak. She didn't kneel. She didn't reach for him. She only stared, arms limp at her sides. And then she turned. Wordless, purposeful. She walked into the bedroom. The sound of drawers opening, the clatter of hangers, the zipper of a suitcase being drawn wide. Dylan stayed on the floor, still crying, still holding the mirror, still feeling in his arms not just silver and glass, but 1,000 mornings, 1,000 sacrifices, 1,000 small, invisible acts of love that had been laughed off, dismissed, ignored. He didn't move when she emerged with her coat on the cat carrier in one hand, a canvas bag in the other. Inside it, he saw the corner of her latest manuscript pages, neatly clipped margin notes scribbled in red. She paused at the door, looked down at him. Not sad, not angry, just done. "I hope she's worth it," she said. He didn't reply. The door clicked behind her, and Dylan Monroe was alone. Truly, finally, utterly alone. No excuses, no distractions, no performative grief, just silence. And the mirror. He lay there for a long time, the sun rising through the blinds in strips of pale gold. He didn't check his phone, didn't call her back, didn't move the mirror. He simply sat beside it, breathing, remembering, being. For the first time in his adult life, Dylan wasn't the man others wanted him to be. He wasn't polished. He wasn't curated. He wasn't safe. He was a man cracked like the glass in his hands, but still holding on to what mattered. And the mirror, it didn't need to show him anything more, because the reflection now was real. It was him, and it wasn't running anymore. The crack in the mirror hadn't spread. That surprised Dylan. He checked it every morning almost reflexively, expecting spiderweb fractures or a full collapse, as if the truth might finally break under the weight of all it had carried. But the damage remained what it was: thin, sharp, precise. A scar, not a wound. It matched him in a way. Days passed in quiet routine. No Isabella, no calls, no door creaks in the night. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the constant whisper of everything he should have said when he had the chance. Then on the 5th morning, something shifted. He was wiping the frame with a cloth gentle, habitual, when his thumb caught on a tiny groove beneath the backplate. A seam, barely visible, but there. He used a flathead screwdriver to pry it open. Not forcefully, respectfully, the way you'd open a time capsule that might contain something fragile. Inside, nestled behind the wood, was a slip of paper, aged, yellowed edges curled inward. He unfolded it. One line, faintly embossed, almost more texture than ink. Children's Art Institute, Mirror Room Number 3. He stared at it for a long moment, unsure if it was real. If it had always been there waiting, or had only revealed itself once he was finally ready. An address was scrawled on the back. No city name, just a set of numbers and a street he didn't recognize. But his hands moved with purpose. He packed a small bag, and he drove. The Children's Art Institute wasn't easy to find. It was buried on the edge of the industrial district, where old factories slouched under rusted signage and wild grass grew unchecked through cracked concrete. He double-checked the address twice, thinking there must be a mistake. But eventually a worn metal placard confirmed it. Children's Art Institute entrance. A studio wing. He stepped inside. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of paint and sawdust. It didn't smell like a school. It smelled like a place where things were made and unmade. Inside, the walls pulsed with color. Crayon drawings, watercolor sunsets, abstract finger paintings, names signed in bright letters with backward S's and oversized hearts for dots. And the mirrors, they were everywhere. Not on walls, but suspended mobile-like from the ceiling. Shards and frames of every shape and hue, some cracked, others polished to brilliance, dangling at different heights. They caught the afternoon light and scattered it across the floor in fragmented rainbows. It was beautiful and a little bit haunting. He wandered down the hall until he saw it etched in fading silver on a cracked glass door. Mirror Room Number 3. He pushed it open. The room was quiet, warmer than the rest. dimmer. The light was filtered through strips of stained glass along the upper windows, casting pools of blue, red, and gold across the tiled floor. And there along the far wall was a long wooden table, empty except for one object in the center. He stepped closer. It was a mirror, but not like the others. This one was framed in smooth ash wood, hand-carved with gentle grooves. There was no Latin etched along the edge, no signature, only an image burned into the back panel in soft sepia tones. A boy, 5, maybe 6, mouth slightly open, eyes wide round with wonder and uncertainty. His hands clutched something soft and small, a teddy bear perhaps. His hair was damp, clinging to his temple. Dylan knew the image before he fully understood it. It was him. It had to be. Not from a photo, not copied from a printout or screen, from memory. The contours weren't perfect. The left ear sat slightly too low, and the chin was more pointed than it had been. But it was him, etched not with precision but with love. He reached out, fingers trembling. Tears pricked his eyes before he could stop them. Behind him a soft voice broke the stillness. She carved it from memory, said it was the only way she wanted to remember you. He turned. A little girl stood by the door, barefoot, paint on her jeans. Her curls were pulled into 2 loose puffs at the top of her head. "Did you know her?" Dylan asked, voice hoarse. The girl nodded. "She was my teacher, all of ours." More children appeared behind her now, peeking from around the doorway, like soft ghosts. They were different ages, different backgrounds, but all shared one thing, the calm, certain knowledge that someone had seen them. "She taught us how to look," the girl said simply. "To look backwards," she replied, "into the good parts, even when they're buried." Dylan knelt. "Is she here?" The girl shook her head. "She left before lunch yesterday, said she had to go somewhere." "Did she say where?" "No, but she left this for you." She reached into her oversized hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. Dylan took it with reverent hands. Inside was a sketch rough in charcoal, a mirror, cracked, held by 2 hands, and beneath it a line written in Althea's handwriting. "Not every reflection is meant to be admired. Some are meant to be faced." Dylan sat back on the floor, legs out, letter in his lap, surrounded by children he didn't know, and yet suddenly felt tethered to. In this place of broken glass and bright color, he didn't feel lost. He felt found. And for the first time, maybe ever, he didn't feel the need to speak. He just needed to stay a little while longer, where the light hit like memory, and the mirror finally looked like forgiveness. The little girl waited by the door like she already knew he wouldn't leave without asking. Her fingers clutched something behind her back, crumpling its edges slightly from how long she must have been holding it. When Dylan finally turned from the carved portrait, his own childhood face staring back at him through time, she stepped forward. "She told me to give you this," the girl said, "only if you came." Dylan knelt down. "She said you might not, but that if you did, I'd know." The envelope she placed in his hand was pale gray. The paper was thick, soft-edged, the kind that only people who still believed in handwriting used anymore. His name was written across it, not just Dylan, but Dylan James Monroe, the way only his mother ever used his full name when she was trying to anchor him to himself. He didn't open it right away. The children behind her were quiet, watching. He nodded once in gratitude, then stepped outside. The sky had shifted. Clouds hung low, full-bellied and waiting to break. There was a breeze now, cool, steady, not cruel, but convincing. He sat on the hood of his car, back against the windshield, and opened the envelope with the care of someone handling the last relic of something sacred. Inside was a single sheet. No date, no greeting, just her voice on paper. "If you're reading this, then the mirror worked, not the glass, but the space it gave you. I don't have time to explain the pain. Not anymore. Not in ways you'd understand without resenting me again. And truthfully, I'm tired of asking you to understand things that didn't fit your version of me. So instead, let me say only this. If you still want to do something that matters, start by loving without needing to apologize for it. You have my strength and my softness. You always did. I never needed a thank you. But I needed you to remember. Now you do. That's enough. Mom." He folded the letter slowly, precisely, then placed it against his chest, closed his eyes, and inhaled. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't reunion. It was release. He opened the trunk of the car and placed the portrait of himself inside beside the mirror, now wrapped carefully in an old quilt he found still folded on the table. One of the children had told him it had been Althea's. They called it the forget-me blanket. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He started driving. No destination at first, just movement. But soon his hands took him somewhere familiar. It was late afternoon when he pulled into the cemetery. The gravel crunched beneath the tires. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. Trees more bare, the iron gate, more rusted the stone path, more uneven. The kind of shrinking only adulthood brings. He walked the last stretch. His father's headstone was in the far corner beneath a line of overgrown hedges. He hadn't been there in years, not since the funeral, not since the day Althea held his hand through the eulogy and whispered, "We go forward now." No other direction. The marker was simple, clean. Marcus J. Monroe, 1964-2003, a good man, a gentle voice. Dylan stood over it silent. Then he knelt and spoke. "Hi, Dad." The wind rustled the branches above, but no other sound came. "I don't know if you'd recognize me," he said. "Sometimes I'm not even sure I do." His hands gripped his knees. "I've spent so much time trying to be impressive, to matter to people who don't even stay. I thought I had to be more than where I came from, more than what she made me." He looked down. "Turns out she made me everything I am." A long breath. "She never told me how hard it was. She just carried it, quietly, fully, like it was the price of keeping me whole." He swallowed hard. "And I let the world make me embarrassed of that." A bird called out somewhere in the trees. Dylan reached into his coat, pulled out the letter from Althea, and placed it at the base of the headstone. "She wrote this for me, but I think some of it was for you too." He paused, then sat cross-legged in the grass-cold earth soaking through his jeans. "I forgot how to be a son," he whispered. The words hung in the air like fog. "But I'm learning again." The wind slowed. Everything stilled. And in that silence, no thunderous revelation, no booming clarity, just the quiet weight of something real settling into his chest. For the first time, he let it be enough. He stayed there until dusk, not for penance, for presence. Then, as the sky bruised toward night, he stood brushed off the dirt and turned toward the car. When he opened the trunk, he looked down at the mirror wrapped in quilt. His hand moved gently over the fabric, and he smiled, not because it made things okay, but because it made him whole. The day Dylan walked back into the Children's Art Institute, it smelled of linseed oil dust and something else faint warm, like old memories warmed over a low flame. The walls hadn't changed. Paper birds still hung from the rafters, suspended in mid-flight, and light filtered through broken-colored glass in kaleidoscopic fragments. He was no longer a guest, now he came to stay. He didn't ask to teach, he asked to repair. He offered his time in exchange for silence. No applause, no titles, no public confession. He worked in the back rooms, the ones where forgotten supplies and discarded canvases lived. Each morning he arrived before the children. Each evening he left after the lights dimmed. He started with the smallest mirror, the one with a cracked blue frame and bits of broken tile embedded like teeth. It had been labeled discard, no restoration possible. He sat with it for hours. He didn't fix the crack. He didn't polish the imperfections away. Instead, he framed it in walnut wood, raw, unfinished, but strong. He hung it on the wall with no label. On his 5th morning, a little boy named Eli pointed at it. "That one makes me feel like I'm still brave." Dylan didn't respond, but inside something splintered and reassembled. He moved on to the next. A mirror framed with shards of sea glass, one with copper wire spiraling along its sides like vines, another with a frame scorched from a house fire still holding on to the faint scent of smoke. All of them signed with a single carved marking, a crescent moon nested within a heart. Her mark, his mother's language, and for the first time Dylan started to understand what she had been saying without ever saying a word. Each mirror was a memory, not of her, but of someone she'd taught helped carried through grief and fear and silence. Some were dark, full of jagged reds and blacks. Others were shimmering golden reaching. It was the 6th week when he entered the back studio and found a long cloth-covered piece leaning against the far wall. He hadn't seen it before. It hadn't been there yesterday. Pinned to the cloth was a note: "Some things you cannot repair, but you can still carry them." His hands trembled as he pulled the fabric back. It was a mirror, massive, rectangular, framed in ashwood, dulled by time but unmistakable. His childhood face stared back at him, not smiling, just watching. The background of the engraving was from the living room of their old home. The threadbare couch, the sagging roof, the curtains with tiny stitched suns. There were two hands cradling his face, his mother's. He stepped back. It wasn't a mirror. It was a portrait, etched and burnished onto reflective steel, but it didn't reflect light. It reflected loss. He touched the edge where the engraving ended. There barely visible was the same Latin inscription that had haunted him solum videbit. Only the one who was sacrificed for will see. He pressed his forehead against the cold surface and wept, not loud, not broken, just silent, constant. And then on the 7th week she returned. It was a Saturday morning. Rain patterned softly on the skylight. Dylan was standing by the sink rinsing soot from a sponge when he saw her in the doorway. Althea. She didn't speak. Her hair was whiter now. A scarf with blue embroidery held it in place. Her hands were no longer calloused, but they were steady. Her clothes were simple earth-toned, the kind that never drew attention. He didn't run to her. She didn't reach out. For a long minute they just looked. Not across time, not through tears, not even through guilt. Just looked. When she finally stepped inside, she walked past him without a sound. She stopped in front of the portrait mirror, tilted her head, studied it like she hadn't seen it before. She raised one finger, brushed a spot near the cheek. "You forgot," she said softly, "you had a dimple here when you were 5. Dylan let out a laugh, sharp, wet, ashamed. "I forgot a lot of things," he whispered. She turned to him then, not stern, not broken, but calm. "I didn't come back to reopen wounds, Dylan. I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said, voice shaking. I need to be near the place where you made sense." She gave him a small smile, one that curved more in her eyes than her lips. "We don't make sense," she said. "We just try to stay whole." They sat side by side in silence on the paint-stained bench. Outside the rain grew heavier. Children's voices echoed down the hallway, muffled behind the wall. Althea pulled out a small cloth-wrapped object from her satchel and handed it to him. He unwrapped it slowly. It was a shard of mirror, just one. Polished on one side, the back inscribed. He turned it over. "Gương nào con chọn giữ lại?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the shard. It was the same piece from the first mirror he'd restored. He gripped it gently, then spoke steady, certain. "The one that reflected the truth I spent my life running from." Her breath caught just barely. "That one," he said, "is the only mirror I never wanted to look into. But it's the only one that ever showed me who I was." Althea nodded. No tears, no speeches. She reached out, took the shard from him, and placed it in a carved box. Then, without a word, she stood and walked toward the shelves. From them, she pulled out a stack of blank frames and began laying them on the table. A quiet invitation. He rose to join her, for the first time not as a boy seeking approval, but as a man ready to build what had once been broken. Together, side by side, they began to arrange the materials, and behind them the light hit the steel engraving on the wall, casting 2 long shadows, one of a mother, one of a son. Finally standing not across a mirror, but beside it, the morning light poured gently into the small art room at the Children's Center. Dust danced in the golden rays, landing on rows of cracked mirrors, waiting for restoration. Among them stood Dylan Monroe, his sleeves rolled up fingers slightly stained with silver dust and glue. His posture was calm, deliberate, changed. Across the room, a dozen children scribbled colors onto glass tiles. Laughter mixed with faint classical music playing from an old cassette deck in the corner. It was a Tuesday, but for Dylan it felt like a new year. Today he wasn't here alone. Althea Monroe stood quietly by the far table, helping a small boy line up mosaic pieces along the edges of a circular mirror. Her presence was subtle but anchoring. She looked older, yes, but not weaker. If anything, she had become more solid, like the oak frames she once carved by hand. At the front of the room, a little girl with glasses raised her hand. "Mr. Dylan, what's this mirror for?" The room fell quiet. Dylan glanced at the child, then at the oval-shaped mirror beside him. It was imperfect. A hairline crack ran across the bottom corner. Its frame had small etchings, stars, waves, leaves, but one word stood out carved in his mother's unmistakable hand. Gratia. Grace. He smiled gently. "This mirror," Dylan began, his voice steady, "is not to see how pretty you are, or how your hair looks. or even to see if you're smiling right. The children leaned in. This mirror, he said, is to look into and see who loved you even when you forgot to look back at them. A hush. The girl blinked. Then slowly she smiled. Althea placed her hand gently on Dylan's shoulder, nodding once. No words needed. For the first time in decades, they stood side by side. Not as mother and child in conflict, but as two artists, two humans who had walked through shame, rejection, anger, and found a bridge made of small, honest moments. Dylan continued the workshop, showing the kids how to press colored glass onto adhesive mesh. "Pick your memories," he said. "Pick something that matters, because that's what we're going to reflect." As they worked, a song began playing on the cassette deck, an old jazz instrumental. Althea's fingers tapped gently in time. Dylan caught the rhythm and added a quiet hum beneath his breath. It wasn't planned, but it was familiar. A boy tugged on Dylan's shirt. "Is she your mom?" Dylan looked over at Althea, who was now showing another child how to rub polish into the glass frame. "Yes," he said, "she is." The boy nodded approvingly. "She's cool." That evening, as the workshop ended and children filed out one by one, Dylan and Althea remained behind. The room was silent except for the ticking of an old clock. Dylan walked over to a newly completed mirror. It was jagged around the edges but glimmered like a starburst. He held it up, tilted it slightly, watching as his own reflection merged with scattered light. "I used to think mirrors were for vanity," he said. "Now I know they're for memory, for humility." Althea stepped beside him. "And for truth, especially the kind we're scared to see." He nodded, voice hushed. "I was scared to look for so long. I didn't want to see the boy you carried through storms. I didn't carry you to be thanked," Althea said softly. "I carried you because I believed you'd grow strong enough to carry someone else." A pause. Dylan's eyes welled up, but he held her gaze. "I think I'm ready now," he said. "You are," she replied, resting her hand on his. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting amber streaks across the room. The mirrors on the wall caught the light, scattering it in dozens of directions, like fragmented memories coming together, like broken love made whole. They stood there for a moment, mother and son bathed in the gentle refracted light.